and other quite large multinationals as well. The bigger project I worked on, which was in slightly further north in Delhi, was with the world's biggest sanitation charity, which is WaterAid. So it was primarily in the area of education around WASH, so sanitary conditions, and then helping people to actually evolve and build WASH projects. Right. So I worked with them in Central Secretariat. It's a very different experience of working really in rural India, very, very simple living. I had a mud hut with solar power, and then all of a sudden I was living in Karol Bagh in the hustle and bustle of Delhi. So I've seen the two extremes. Then I've spent plenty of time traveling around, and a lot of time in Rishikesh. That's somewhere that's very close to my heart. I trained as a yoga teacher there as well. And when I was living in Delhi, I went to the Desai Institute and did pranayama every single day. So yeah, it's something that's very close to my heart, but it was a fantastic experience. I really enjoyed it.
That's great. And I think you have seen perhaps the best of both worlds, as we call it in India. So Chris, I was curious if you would not mind sharing some of your childhood experiences. Where are you from? How was your youth like? How was your childhood like?
Sure. Yeah. It's funny because when you mentioned that just before the interview, I don't think I've ever had a podcast interview where I've talked about my childhood. It kind of feels like a little bit like therapy. So do stop me if I go into too much detail. But just, I mean, kind of the big picture is that I was born in the UK, and I no longer live there. I haven't lived in the UK for about 20 years now. So I grew up in a small town called Fleet. It's famous in the UK for having a petrol station on the motorway, and Hampshire as a county is famous for the filming of Downton Abbey. So I don't know if you've seen Downton Abbey, but it's very posh with all these big houses. So somebody asked me where I'm from, I kind of say, look, it's in between a service station, as in a petrol station, and Downton Abbey. So two extremes, like you were saying about India. But it's a very small town. It's kind of a commuter town for London. So it's about 45 minutes on the train from London. And my family actually grew up in the north of England. So they grew up in Lancashire, and they moved down. And I was the first one in the family to be born in the south of England, which is quite different. There's a very different kind of cultural history between the north and the south. And I feel quite blessed to have the mix of my family coming from the north, but having grown up in the south. So I had a very loving childhood. I guess the one challenge that I had, which was a very personal thing, was my mother was very sick for most of my childhood. So for a lot of the time, my mum was in hospital, and I was kind of raised by friends of the family. And I'm an only child, which just coming to kind of the present day is something I still struggle with as far as loneliness. I'm somebody who has a lot of social connections, but if I'm to be honest, loneliness is something I'm talking more and more about. And I know it's obviously now an issue that so many people have around the globe, especially in the world of lockdown. So something that from my own research, I'm really keen to kind of learn more about how I can share my own experience and help other people. So I went to Polytechnic, because I'm not going to say university, in Cambridge, because there is a big difference. But I did go to Cambridge, and I was allowed to go into the Cambridge University. They let me into their societies and clubs. So I was in a couple of their clubs, but I studied economics there. And it was a dual degree. So I spent a year in the Netherlands as well, and got a diploma in administration there and in business administration. So had a really, really lovely time at university, really enjoyed that. I think at the time I was my personality type was very much driven by things, very extrinsic. So I wanted to have a car, I wanted to have, the girlfriend and the foreign holidays. So I got into sales and primarily technology sales, because I saw that was a quick way to make money. And that really drove me then to get more into technology. It took me to a number of different places. So I started my working career in the UK, but then I spent a year in Australia. I then, after about 5 years of working in that space, I decided to take a break and moved over to South America, where I worked in not-for-profits in between Peru, Bolivia, Argentina, and then traveled around some other places as well. So I kind of always had this side, let's call it a side hustle, which was the charity side. And I think that probably stemmed from my childhood, because my parents were very religious, and I would have grown up going to a lot of kind of church-based charity events. And that's not saying that you can't do charity events away from the church, because it's a global thing. And I'm no longer now, personally, I don't have an association with the church, and I'm still very involved in charity, but it was nice that I'd had that as my childhood. So when I came back from South America, I decided that much as I loved the UK, I wanted to try and live somewhere a little different. I'd made a number of really, really good connections over in Ireland. So I decided to come here, which was 15 years ago now. I ended up working in technology again for one of the world's biggest consultancies, which is Capgemini, who I know probably have about 200,000 employees over in India. So I worked for them primarily in the areas of business analytics and data analytics and big data, as it's now called. It used to be analytics and business intelligence. And that's kind of where I stayed for quite a long time. And then, as I mentioned, in 2012, I changed career. And I don't know if you want me to start as far as the evolution of UnPlug, or you want me to pause there?
We can take that up at a later stage. I was very curious when I was going through, your profile and doing my research. Most of the people do not venture out from where you are. So you were into tech consulting, right? Tech consulting, which is perhaps the go-to destination for any normal guy. So what actually prompted you to venture out from that domain and come into the domain that you are today?
Yeah, and I think it's definitely something that is a very attractive career. And I still love technology, and I definitely enjoyed a lot of it. But I think what I found was when people were asking me what I did for a living, I was talking about the charity work. I wasn't talking about what I did within the world of technology. A lot of that was really just to pay the bills. And that was how I felt. I have friends, some of my best friends still work in that space and really, really love it and get a lot from it. So I was all about how can I make change? And, that's kind of evolved into my day job now. And I love being able to see change, but from a very social point of view. Whereas when I was in tech, it was more about, okay, how can I make this company more money? And those kind of things. So it was very much, as I learned to develop my time in India, it was a heart-led approach. I was really following my heart as opposed to my head. And now I find myself in this lovely crossroads where I'm serving a social purpose, but I'm also working in the world of technology.
Right, and I think that's great. It's rare that people find this sort of a balance, but it's wonderful. So tell me, Chris, when did you decide actually to get full-time into entrepreneurship? I mean, was it always in the back of your mind, or it was a spur of the moment thing? How did it work for you?
Yeah, I definitely think there was one key moment, but just leading up to that, my father had been an entrepreneur. He'd run a number of businesses growing up. And I think I'd seen the good and the bad side of that. And you'll know this from being an entrepreneur yourself, it's incredibly long hours and quite often not for much return. I saw my father and my parents go through some really hard times financially. We had times when we were, didn't go on holiday for years and we're eating beans on toast and really quite restrictive lifestyles based on him just seeing this dream. But in his later years, he did become quite successful. Unfortunately, he passed away just before his retirement, which was very sad because, that's what he'd been focusing on his whole life. Right. For me, when I was initially working, I think I wasn't too interested in doing my own thing. I had a couple of friends who I did start small businesses with, and they didn't really evolve anywhere. So I actually worked with a friend in the travel industry. He had a couple of hotels, and we set up a small travel consultancy. I feel very lucky that I didn't go in that direction because it was just before a big recession. But then probably the biggest game changer for me, when I was coming back from India, a friend of mine who knew my lifestyle and what I liked doing. I'd run a number of events before I went to India, and he said, look, there's this really cool event called Morning Gloryville in London. It's a morning rave, it's sober, and it's all about people coming together, social connection, a really happy well-being event. I would love to do it in Ireland, and I think you might have the drive to do it. And so I looked at it, and initially, if I'm to be honest, Jayesh, I thought it was a little bit crazy, a morning rave without alcohol in Ireland. I'd love that, but I just thought that's quite almost, polar opposites as to kind of the stereotype, sadly. But the mad thing is, we worked really, really hard. We're one of the first countries outside of the UK to run Morning Gloryville. And the first couple of events, we had nearly 1,000 people. I was on the front page of all the main media here, television interviews. And all of a sudden I thought, hang on, I can do this. So, I can do this with a brand and a logo and a brand and a concept. And that was I think the thing that really got me was it wasn't just setting up a business. It wasn't opening a yoga studio, which lots of people have done, or doing some repeat business for someone else. This was a completely new pioneering concept.
Right.
And that's the bit I loved. I loved kind of really breaking against the mold. So that gave me the appetite for what I've done with UnPlug. So I have to, you know, take my hat off to my friend, Ed Hurrell, because he was the one who said, look, you can do this. And we did it together. And it was, yeah, it was a lot of fun,
Great, great, great. I think what you're doing is wonderful. I think without you know beating around the bush, let us get into the second segment of this episode, which I called Power Play. Right. So tell us something about UnPlug. How did it come about? What is the venture all about?
Sure. Well, as I've already kind of alluded to, when I was in technology, I loved technology, and I still do. And back then and still now, I've always been a very early adopter. So I was one of the first people in the office to get an iPhone, one of the first people to get a tablet. And I kind of just consumed all of it initially. I was like, wow, all of a sudden we can work out of office hours. This is amazing. And I never stood back and thought of the consequences. So I found myself multitasking and working as an always-on culture probably about 10 years ago, which it wasn't really that common in those days. Initially, I thought that was a really good thing. And then in the long run, it started to have a really negative impact on my own productivity and my well-being.
Right.
So then in parallel, I chipped and I was heading.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Sorry, I thought the line was
Yeah, I think yeah, I can still see
for prolonged periods of time.
Right, right.
Okay, can you hear me? I
Yes.
have full coverage.
Think
My
video, I think, is frozen, but your audio is clear.
Okay, great. So yeah, it was almost having control in India, and that when I was access to those around me, as far as when I came back to my mum, and I hadn't seen some of the most important people for quite a long time, and I noticed that I necessarily have all my energy in the room. I wanted to be on Facebook. Like, how is this? Why am I feeling this pull? So at the time, I then started to speak to friends who are psychologists and neuroscientists and even anthropologists and kind of wider in social sciences. And a lot of them were saying, look, there's definitely some correlation here. There isn't any causation, but there's definitely no impacts into mental health, impacts into productivity and all these different areas. So I just started to put together a team and some ideas. And initially it was around events as to help people take some time away from technology. Then we ran a big festival for families called UnPlug for Kids. And what we soon realized was two things. One of the biggest influences for the majority of us would be the workplace and the culture of how we use digital technology there. And then secondly, for me, my background being the corporate, it was the easiest, and for the rest of the team, the easiest way for us to actually grow our base and understanding, because although a lot of them were academics, some had masters in coaching and corporate leadership. So there was a bit of an on working in the corporate space. And for the first couple of years, I think a lot of the time we spent was almost just advocacy. We had to explain what the concept of digital well-being was, digital culture was. You know, it's gone through a number of iterations. I think a long time ago, there was this term digital detox, which we never really liked because it suggests technology is bad and that you can just get rid of it over a weekend. Whereas for us, we've always said, look, technology is neutral. It has fantastic power and, you know, lots of things we can use and get a lot from, but at the same time we need to be in control and actually manage that as opposed to it managing us. So when we started, it was really raising the awareness, and now we've got to the stage where we're developing strategies. So Google, we were actually involved, their digital well-being launched in 2018, but it's now in the mainstream lexicon. It doesn't mean we're out the door as far as busy, but it's something that's definitely more mainstream as in discussion. And the likes of lockdown has really brought it to the front. You know, Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, said back in April, we've had 2 years of digital transformation in 2 months. And whilst that's really exciting, and kudos to all the IT departments around the world, there is also an impact on our behavior as humans, and we have to just take that on board. How is this impacting our focus? How is this impacting our ability to switch off and recharge and be effective? And then there is around, you know, social connection versus technology connection in real life. So there's lots of ancillary areas, but it's, for me, there's a lovely, within my own kind of drive, a lovely connection between what I love in the technology world and then what I love as far as develop and drive social change for good.
Right, right. And I think absolutely on point when it comes to the importance and the relevance of digital well-being. It has never been more relevant and more required as far as our lives are concerned, both personal and professional. So, Chris, tell me, if you could, you know, give one phrase or one line, which is the driving force or the driving thought behind UnPlug, what would that be?
It's probably personal experience, because everyone on the team, and me definitely included, you know, I've felt and I still feel how technology can influence us, and being aware as to how I need to change that in order to be effective as a human.
Right.
You know, because I still, even at the beginning of lockdown, I was like, okay, I need to have my boundaries even clear, because I don't have a huge house with a designated office. I need to make sure that although I'm doing lots of Zoom calls, I also need to make sure, am I seeing humans in real life? So, you know, let's put a stepladder up in the garden and just say hello to my neighbor in real life. So it's making sure, you know, I've been through this and I still feel it every day. Probably one of my funniest personal experiences is the likes of dating sites. And I know the likes of Tinder is one of the most gamified, and when it comes to thing that, you know, I'm a single guy, I want to go on there, but I'm very, very disciplined in how I use that technology. But the cleverer it gets, it almost makes me want to do more of this work, which is why I'm still here.
Right, right. And I think one very important question, Chris, is that what you are doing, I mean, what you are doing at UnPlug is kind of a balance between a social enterprise and a commercial enterprise. So how do you balance that? How do you balance the financial consideration with the social cause that you're espousing? How do you do that?
Yeah, it was a question that we're still kind of, it's a little bit fluid for us, if I'm to be honest. I think if we were in a situation where we had, you know, a year to 2 years worth of corporate bookings, then it would be easy for us to forecast. The market is so new. It's so fluid that it's really hard for us to do that. You know, we've been in situations where in March we had 6 months worth of work, and all of a sudden at the end of March we had 0 work, and we've had to pivot to do web delivery, and now we're in pretty good shape. So for us, we've definitely always been a commercial organization, but the social slant, we do a lot of work with charities, primarily for free. So we would go in and actually do web deliveries now for charities. And a lot of the work we did in the schools was either sponsored or we did it pro bono. So there was a kind of a little bit of a parallel there, but it was more in a way like a social responsibility arm as a, but it's a little bit of a blurred line for us at the moment, but right now we're a commercial organization.
Right. So what I hear you saying is that you would do the commercial part of the venture. However, that part of it funds the organization and the pro bono initiatives. Does that sound like what you do?
That's right. Right. Yeah.
Fair, fair. Because I think a lot of social entrepreneurs right now are struggling between juggling the commercial part of it and the social part of it. So I think this is a great learning and very important for them to be incorporated in the foundation itself. So Chris, I wanted to pick your brain on one more thing. What are the key differences that you see between the social media usage patterns of the so-called digital natives and the digital migrants. So maybe generation Y and Z are digital natives who are born in this, and people
Yeah.
before them are digital migrants.
Yeah. I, I would see, so my generation, which would be the older generation, there's a lot less awareness. So it's kind of, it's as if when I do the talks, I'm quite surprised by how few people know about things like changing notification settings, or even using some of the wonderful tools that are in iOS and Android. Whereas when we work with some of the younger generations, they know all of that stuff. At the same time, so they're so much more aware, but at the same time, I think they're also a lot more vulnerable. So there's a real fine balance in that the older generations might not know how to use the tech as well, although there's an assumption we would. The younger generations just picking it up. They're so much more aware that there are challenges there. You know, they're seeing things like the Netflix documentary Social Dilemma and starting to take it very seriously. But I do fear that they're slightly more because when you watch it, and you're open to, you know, you want to impress people, you want to have romantic adventures, and all these things potentially make you the likes of information and social media, or the need to connect through the likes of Tinder and the likes.
Right. Right. So also, Chris, I wanted to understand, as highlighted by the documentary as well, which you were talking about, the social dilemma. I always see technology by drawing a parallel with cholesterol. So there's always good cholesterol and bad cholesterol, right? So how do you kind of draw that thin line between good technology and bad technology?
I love that analogy. There's a wonderful psychologist down in Australia called Jocelyn Brewer, who her whole thing is digital news. I think with doing good and bad, the challenge with that, it's different for every single one of us.
Absolutely.
You know, there are actually needs for their job or for their research, need to spend time on YouTube or on Facebook or on LinkedIn. I think the key for me is being aware. Once we know, okay, so if I look at my last week of how much time I've spent on Tinder, I can start to say, okay, well, is 2 hours a day, which I don't, by the way, but if I was on 2 hours a day of Tinder, is that an effective use of my time? Whereas 15 minutes a day on Tinder, that might help me have a future relationship. So there's a balance there. So it's finding what you think. I mean, there are very obvious contenders, the likes of the entertainment and the social media typically would be, you know, your high fats and sugary food, whereas more educational resources might be more healthier, your greens, let's say. But it's a really personal thing. And I think for me, one of the big ones people have size fits all. And it's not. We're within the space of 14 years, with big changes we can all look to implement. But I think finding out our own patterns and what works for us and what doesn't is the most important thing. The first thing to help us change.
Right. And I think perhaps the biggest opportunity and the biggest threat both lie in the fact that technology has become too personal for an individual. So there is no standard prescription that we can issue. So I think one aspect of technology usage, especially social media, is the phenomenon which in the millennial lingo is called FOMO, or fear of missing out. So my question to you, Chris, would be that you yourself are not on Facebook and Instagram. You barely use Twitter and LinkedIn. So how do you deal with this FOMO? How do you deal with trends happening and you not being present to witness them live?
I missed some of that. Did you say I'm not on social media, so how do I deal with FOMO? Was that right?
Yeah, partly, yes.
Okay. So I am on social media, but in very small doses. So for example, back to that concept of, you know, it being a useful product and making sure we're in control. I would use Instagram, I'd say probably once a month. Twitter, I use probably the most because I find it very useful within my own research. And when I'm doing my dissertation for my master's at the moment. So I find it really useful for that. And Facebook, for example, right now, I'm speaking to a number of friends in India and making sure, checking in with friends around the world, how people are just doing at the moment. So this is, it's that double-edged sword of, if we can make sure we're in control, there are some wonderful benefits to it. But at the same time, I'm going for more than 10 minutes on editing, be here, Habit Lab product, which will restrict how much time I actually spend on products. So I would definitely use them. I think if we look at the research specifically into teenagers, and this is something that it's evolving, obviously, but the concept of having no technology at all is definitely a negative thing. That is FOMO. And so there needs to be a small dose, but I think it's a lot harder the younger people are, because it's really hard for them to regulate. Whereas someone my age of 45, it's easier for me to regulate, so I can have controls in place. As I said, like a little pop-up just saying, maybe, do you really want to be at WhatsApp at 2 o'clock in the morning? For me to go on WhatsApp at 2 o'clock in the morning is actually very hard, because my internet is switched off, all of my devices are on flight mode, and WhatsApp will automatically switch off anyway at 8 o'clock. I have about 3 or 4 things that I would have to override. So if there's an emergency, definitely get on there. But all these little parts of friction will cause me to rethink about, it's like the diet where we put the cookie jar on the higher shelf. By the time you get to the higher shelf, you're going, I don't know if this was the best idea. But if you really want a cookie, you're going to do it.
Right. Fair, I think, and that probably will be a lot more useful. So let me jump into the third segment that I call Silly Point. Right. So these are basically quick-fire questions, Chris, that you can answer back to back. And I think the quicker you answer, the more points you get, if that concept exists. Right. The points are completely abstract.
Right.
So that's how it is. Yeah. So my first question to you, Chris, would be, what is your go-to piece of literature that helps you introspect?
Go-to piece of literature in relation to UnPlug?
No, which helps you introspect in general. So it could be UnPlug, it could be your personal life as well.
So yeah, as far as introspect, I'd say probably a poetry book by Dana Folds. It's something that I find really, really grounding. She's one of my favorite poets.
Sure. So are you into movies?
I am, yes.
Okay, so name your favorite all-time movie.
Oh, this is the hardest question ever, Jayesh, because it really depends on the mood. Do you know what? I'm going to restrict it to Bollywood films, right? And there is by far my all-time favorite movie. Although Eka the Tiger was filmed in Dublin, and I met the late Girish Ganesh, because he was part of Kalkari Sangeet Pichala. My number one Indian film, The Three Idiots, by a long shot. I love it. It's such a beautiful film, because I think it challenges, we all have challenges within every society. And for me, it was the first Indian film I saw challenges some of the biggest issues that are in India, but in such an epically beautiful way with humor. And then, the whole Bollywood's bubble, which just makes it magical. So that's a great Bollywood film for me.
I must add that it is a phenomenal choice, and definitely on top 5 of mine as well. So we find common ground there. A favorite band or favorite musician?
Favorite band or musician?
Sorry,
Indian twist here. I'm one of the people who actually, his music, again, there's a slight Indian influence here. One of the people who really influenced me, even just to start looking at going to India, this would have been like 20 years ago. I got a demo tape from an album called Broken Skin by a guy called Nitin Sawhney, whose parents came over from India in the 1960s or 70s to the UK. And he took Hindustani classical music and he added in all these different Western influences. And it's one of the beautiful artists I've ever come across in my life. I've seen him live so many times. And I saw him do it was the first COVID gig that I went to online through Zoom. And it was just, even seeing it through Zoom, the nostalgia was beautiful, because not only has it influenced me, but having had the fortunate opportunity to work with a Hindustani classical music school in Kalkari, it reminds me of that. You know, I also have a strong Bhakti practice, so I have a Shutri box here, and I have a little sing song every day. So you know, that's a big part of my life.
Right, that's great. Favorite holiday destination?
I think you should know this already. Right? I think, look, if I'm looking for a short weekend away, I would say something simple in Europe, and probably somewhere in Ireland. Right. But if I have a holiday, if I could just choose one holiday every year, it'd be somewhere either Rishikesh or Anjuna, somewhere like that. So yeah, I mean, I used to go to Rishikesh back every year for a month after I lived there, just for the International Yoga Festival, and to see Prem Baba and Muji and all those guys. Yeah.
Right. What is your guilty pleasure?
My what? Sorry.
I'm saying, what is your guilty pleasure? What is the one pleasure?
Guilty pleasure.
That you speak? Yeah, that so you can call it a cheap thrill.
Yeah. So I definitely watched some really poor series on Netflix. So I absolutely loved Tiger King, and a year called Benidorm, which is about a really trashy comedy set in the south of Spain, about English holidaymakers, but it's popcorn for the brain. And every once in a while I'll sink into, you know, 2 to 3 hours of that if I've got nothing else on. Right now, that's impossible because I'm back doing the masters, and I'm setting up a new business, and UnPlug is busy. So yeah, very little Netflix, but I do. Yeah, I'm looking for the next Tiger King.
Okay, great. So if you were to become the world technology president for a day, what would be the first thing that you do?
The world technology what? Sorry, Jayesh,
the world technology president. So you are in charge of the entire world's technology and how it would develop.
Wow. I think, you know, that the likes of the social media platforms didn't initially go to market with the idea of need for time spent on sites to break up how they evolved. So, you know, I would love it if all sites become subscription based, but for there also to be a free model for people who can't afford it.
Okay.
I see sort of whereby all those companies are subscription based, and it's not driven by advertising, because then it really drives the attention economy.
Right. I think fair. Okay, one last question in this segment. If there is one piece of advice that you have for 20-year-old Chris, what would that be?
Slow down. I still am very guilty of this. I try to fit too much in. And I think the only time I've really slowed down, like when my father was with a brain tumor, I spent more time with him, and I'm so grateful for that. But even when I was in India, and I was in some of the most beautiful places I've ever been to in the world, and it was all about, I'll take the photos and get the likes on social media, because that was the mindset that I had at the time. Now I did definitely slow down whilst I was there. He was, from the majority of my adult life, was obsessed with being busy. And I'm now a lot less obsessed with that. I take a lot more kind of mindful moments, as people say now. But I think as a teenager, I just would really have encouraged myself to slow down a little bit.
Right. And I think perhaps that is one piece of advice that applies to all of us, right? Especially in our generation, where things are progressing so quickly. It becomes very important to slow down and let the good things sink in. Chris, my last and final segment is called slogovers, right? So I have three questions which I think would be for the benefit of the entrepreneurial community at large. But before that,
Mhm.
what is the single most important milestone that you wish to achieve?
I missed that last question. Sorry, Jayesh, say again.
Yeah, so I'm saying, what is the single most important milestone that you wish to achieve? Your big, hairy, audacious goal.
Big, hairy, audacious goal. Yeah, so I would, I don't think this is that big a milestone, but when I was working in Calicut Sangeet Vidyalaya, which is the school down in Karnataka, it was working with a number of underprivileged children, one of whom I now sponsor. So I've worked with her and I know her and we write each other letters. And I would love to offer her the opportunity at one stage to maybe come to Europe on holiday. And then if she was to enjoy it, to maybe offer her a position as a job, whether it's an UnPlug or something else. You know, I would love to have a continuous, closer to home relationship with India and Sujata. I have so many friends that I speak to on a regular basis over there who, you know, they help me and I help them out as well. But with Sujata, she's come from a really tough background. She's an incredibly bright girl and I'd love to give her the opportunity, but I'm definitely not in a position to do that yet.
I think that is as big a goal as any. I mean, helping someone with that kind of a background and keeping that in mind after so long, I think it doesn't get bigger and hairier than this, Chris. Pun not intended.
Okay.
Right. So I wanted to pick your brain also on skills which entrepreneurs need to inculcate in themselves. So, in your mind, what are the two most important skills that entrepreneurs, especially ones who are pursuing a social cause, need to have or need to inculcate in themselves?
Yeah, from my own experience, I think probably the one thing that I've only really learned in more recent times is self-compassion. And it's ironic, you know, because when I set up UnPlug, I definitely had been on loads of retreats where I worked with self-compassion and studied it. But I think when you're very passionate about a subject, so especially for social entrepreneurs and for pioneers, almost nothing else matters. You know, everything else takes second place.
Right.
And I found myself a couple of years ago in a situation where financially I was paying the team, but I'd cut back on my own expenditure. I wasn't socializing. I didn't go on holiday. I didn't date, because the only thing that really mattered was the success of the company, which never works in the long run. You know, in the short run, for maybe a couple of months, that's a really good way to, you know, build a product overnight. But for UnPlug, it's been a very, very slow build, and it still is because it's such a new space. So I'm definitely now a lot more self-compassionate. I give myself a lot more time. I'm just starting up a new business in the world of breathwork with a friend. And I'm looking at it very differently. You know, I'm having a lot more fun with it. I'm taking more time as opposed to giving myself strict deadlines of, okay, we've got to be in this many companies by this time. And I think especially in today's world where we have such challenging news every single day, you know, we don't know what's going to happen in the next couple of weeks as far as changes in lockdowns and curfews and potential positive news around vaccines. So because of that, our brain is spending so much time just coping with life. If we're not self-compassionate about our business and how we're achieving things, it's really hard to work as a human. And I think it's probably even more so in India, but in Ireland, there's a lot of pressure when you're an entrepreneur. There's this whole thing of, you know, you should be scaling and flipping the company and building something that's going to change the world. A few companies actually do that, you know. So if you can stay going as a business for a couple of years and then down the road have a positive impact, amazing. But you can only do that if you look after yourself first of all. And I had some really, really tough, and if I'm to be honest, very dark learnings for that. So I'm very blessed that I have a very good business partner, Aidan, who really, you know, he made sure that not only were we working well together and effectively as an organization, but he made sure I stepped back when I needed to. So I'm very blessed to have a solid business partner like that.
Right. And I think probably this I could draw a parallel to cooking, right? It may help you to cook sometimes on a high flame, and it's good to get it cooked early. But you actually get the great taste that you want if you cook it, if you let it simmer. If you cook it on a low flame and let it take its time, so you have to nurture the dish
Yeah.
towards it. Um, right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Perhaps two questions I have. One, the second last question would be that um, how do you actually decide if the cause that you are maybe passionate about, or if you are interested in the cause? Uh, Starting a venture about that cause is not just a trend, or is not just a fad for you, or it's not just a phase for you. I mean, a lot of entrepreneurs actually go ahead and
Mm.
start a venture purely because the wind is blowing that way. So, how do you actually test that out? What are the two, three questions that you ask yourself?
Yeah, I think that's, for me, that really just comes down to actually being able to survive in a way financially. So 5 years ago is when it was actually the first event we ran was October 2015, and we were on the 6 o'clock news, which is the biggest media channel in Ireland, on RTE 6 o'clock news. And in a way that didn't help us, because what that did was that fed our egos, and we thought, oh my God, this is it, it's going to be amazing. When what the really important thing we should have been doing was basing it on, okay, yeah, we're having an impact, but we need to make sure all our expenses are covered, and we're actually growing in a very organic, natural way. I think I had a lot of pressure on myself to grow very quickly. So yeah, it was important for me, as far as if I'm looking back, just to focus on, okay, really look at the nuts and bolts of, if you're putting out, there's always going to be, whether you get a loan or some sort of outlay at the beginning, more so with a product than with services, but making sure, that whole, even putting a value on yourself. When we did our first couple of corporate workshops, I was like, okay, how much should I charge for going into Dell or going into HubSpot? And then looking at it and not just going, this isn't me, this is supporting a research organization and all the different assets that we have. And also then a value on the product that we have as a service, because what we have as a service now, I mean, the feedback we have from our deliveries is incredible, but we've spent years getting it right. But it's still hard sometimes to go, okay, for an hour, is that the right number? And it's making sure that's covering everything, and you're really valuing yourself and valuing the organization.
Right. So what I hear you saying is that if you are actually able to go through the grind, or if you are prepared to go through the grind, then that venture is for you. Otherwise, it is just a phase, and you need to give it time to simmer and mature. Right. Fair. Fair. So, Chris.
But also, I mean, I think it's being aware that you could step away.
Right, Chris, you were saying something.
Yes, sir. I think it's important also to have in your mindset the option of stepping away. That's something that I did for a number of months with UnPlug, where I got to the stage where, okay, I'm so in this, but it's not actually a healthy relationship for me, because from a reciprocal point of view, I'm not getting motivated from, I'm having no income. And so I'm almost having a negative association in my mind with UnPlug. So I stepped away, but it took me a long time to do that from an ego point of view, because I didn't want to step away. I was lucky to have a business partner that kind of gave me that flexibility to do that for a few months. But very few entrepreneurs, it's almost, it's almost just two choices, like success, failure. Whereas if you have the right business relationship with a partner or similar, you can sometimes work around that. But I think you need to have the option of saying and questioning all the time. I mean, I still do this every couple of months of just going, is this the right business to be in? Are we making enough money for me to hours whilst having a positive impact? And is this actually growing in the right way? And that's still very hard, especially in this world of digital well-being, because it's so fluid. It really is. I mean, even just in the last 6 months, and every company has faced difficulties, but for us, having loads of work as of March just cancelled. And now with it all being web delivery, the majority of that's fine. But I had a client this week who it's a delivery of an hour, and it's probably taken me 2 days in preparing it, because their technology is quite old and it's a totally different kind of delivery. So yeah, it's still not simple. So yeah, I'm still, I think actually just one thing to add on that, Jayesh.
Yeah, sure.
One of the first business books I read was Andy Grove, one of the founders of Intel, and it's
Right.
called Only the Paranoid Survive. And I read it when I was like 20 or something. So this was a long time ago. But I think what that gave me was, some of that is quite a negative thing because, you know, it almost invokes a little bit of anxiety. But the positive from it is it allowed me to question everything, you know, just going, okay, yeah, this looks really shiny and that we're in this big client, that's great, but are they paying us? You know, is their credit good? Do we have enough to last for the next 3 months if everything was to change with COVID and there was no more work?
Right.
You know, and asking that question whilst at the same time being kind to yourself. But I think there's that risk mitigation is something that, you know, when you have passion for something, you need to be able to either step away or question it really hard as to whether it's the right thing to do.
Right, right, right. And I think, Chris, that is beautifully articulated, and I think becomes very important for entrepreneurs to not be obsessed with their creation, not to fall unusually or unnecessarily in love with what they are doing, but be calm, objective, and evaluate where they are going and where they want to go. So, Chris, I think that's it we have for today. If there are any parting words which you would want to share with the entire entrepreneurial community, it would be great.
Yeah, I think whenever I meet entrepreneurs now, whether they're at the start or wherever they are in the start of the journey, it's just coming back to that, you know, are you also doing what you love? You know, because especially when it's a social cause, there's a lot of passion there, but you know, what are the other things that you love? Are you still seeing your friends? Are you still doing sport? Are you still getting to the mountains? Are you still eating and cooking food, dancing, singing? Because those little elements of joy, that's the little things that we need to keep us going. And especially in today's world, it's harder to do. And we almost give ourselves this excuse of, no, I'll just focus on the business because lockdown is, you know, it's not allowing us to do all these other things. So make sure you're doing them even more, you know. I know when lockdown first started, every morning I was getting out, and even when it was cold here, I was dancing out on my grass with my bare feet. I'm a little bit of a hippie in that respect, but you know, it's making sure you have those things, because otherwise all of a sudden you're just all focused on work, and no matter how strong, resilient and passionate about the project you are, that's not going to work in the long run.
Right. I think that's it we have for today, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks, Chris. Thanks a lot for this wonderful session. And it was great connecting with you.
Thank you. Lovely. Thanks for the opportunity, Jayesh. Really appreciate that.
Thanks, Chris. I think just a minute.